There is a face in Berlin that has stared back at the modern world for over a century, and for most of that time, we assumed we understood it. Graceful neck, high cheekbones, one perfectly inlaid eye, one unsettling empty socket. The bust of Nefertiti is arguably the most recognizable portrait from the ancient world, the kind of image that ends up on museum posters and coffee mugs and the covers of paperback history books. We think we know her, but here is the thing: beneath that smooth, painted plaster surface, there is another face, a different face, one that the sculptor hid from view and that no human eye was ever meant to see, a face that stayed secret for roughly 3,000 years, until the kind of scanning technology we developed to look inside living bodies was turned on a lump of painted limestone from ancient Egypt. What the scans revealed about the construction of that bust raises questions that Egyptologists are still wrestling with. Questions about idealism and truth, about why an artist would bury one version of a face beneath another, and about what Nefertiti herself actually looked like, and who she actually was. Because the more you look into this woman, the stranger it gets. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end of this story, the mystery is going to feel bigger, not smaller. Let's go back to the beginning. The year is 1912, and a German archaeological team is excavating the ancient city of Amarna, a place the Egyptians once called Akhetaten, on the east bank of the Nile in what is now Middle Egypt. The expedition is led by Ludwig Borchardt, a meticulous and deeply experienced archaeologist. They are working through the ruins of what turns out to be the workshop of a royal sculptor, a man whose name we actually know from inscriptions found at the site, Thutmose, master sculptor to the pharaoh. In the rubble of that workshop, Borchardt's team finds the bust. Still largely intact after more than 3,000 years in the dirt, he photographs it, records it, and, according to the accounts that survive, is struck almost immediately by what he sees. In his field notes, it is said he wrote simply that the description is useless. You just have to see it. The bust was transported to Germany under circumstances that Egypt has contested ever since, and it eventually made its home in Berlin, where it now sits behind glass in the Neues Museum. For decades, the world accepted the bust as a masterwork of royal portraiture and left it at that. A beautiful object, a window into an ancient face. End of story. Except it was not the end of the story at all. To understand why the scans matter so much, you have to understand the world that produced this object. Nefertiti was the great royal wife, the chief queen, of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, roughly in the 14th century before the Common Era. That reign is one of the strangest chapters in all of Egyptian history, and that is saying something for a civilization that gave us mummified crocodiles and gods with the heads of ibises. Akhenaten did something almost unthinkable in ancient Egypt. He dismantled the existing religious order, a vast, deeply embedded pantheon of gods that had shaped Egyptian life for centuries, and replaced it, largely by royal decree, with the worship of a single deity, the Aten, the disk of the sun. He moved the capital away from the old priestly centers of power and built an entirely new city, Amarna, from scratch in the desert. In that city, the royal family was portrayed in an entirely new artistic style. Elongated limbs, soft features, intimate domestic scenes of the pharaoh playing with his daughters. It was radical. It was strange. It was unlike anything that had come before, or would come after, in Egyptian art. And at the center of it all, depicted again and again in temple reliefs and statuary, was Nefertiti, not standing quietly beside her husband, the way royal wives were usually shown, but standing with him, sometimes at the same scale, sometimes performing religious rituals that were normally the exclusive domain of the pharaoh. There are images from Amarna that show Nefertiti alone, wearing the double crown of Egypt, smiting enemies in the classic pose of a warrior king. That particular image has kept scholars arguing for generations, but we will come back to that. The bust of Nefertiti was produced in this revolutionary workshop, under these extraordinary circumstances, during one of the most unusual reigns in the ancient world. It was, almost certainly, a sculptor's model, a master reference piece from which other portraits of the Queen could be made. That context matters a great deal, as it turns out. In the early years of this century, researchers were given permission to perform non-invasive CT scanning on the bust, the same kind of computerized tomography used in hospitals to see inside the human body without touching it. The goal was partly conservation, partly curiosity. What they found surprised everyone involved. The bust is not what it appears to be from the outside. Beneath the smoothly painted plaster surface, there is an inner core made of limestone. And on that limestone core, the sculptor Thutmose had carved a face, a complete, detailed portrait of Nefertiti, before covering it with a layer of stucco plaster and painting over it to create the version the world knows. Two faces, one buried inside the other. Now, here is where it gets genuinely fascinating. The two faces are not the same. The inner limestone face, the one hidden from view, is subtly but meaningfully different from the outer plaster one. The inner face has small creases at the corners of the mouth, a barely perceptible bump along the bridge of the nose, slight hollows under the eyes that suggest a real, lived-in face, the kind of face that has squinted against desert sun and maybe lost a little sleep. The outer face, the one we see, is smoother, more symmetrical, more perfect. The lines have been softened, the imperfections have been quite literally plastered over. So what does that mean? There are a few different ways to interpret it, and scholars genuinely disagree, which I find refreshing. Honest uncertainty in archaeology is worth a lot more than confident nonsense. One interpretation is fairly straightforward. The inner limestone carving was an earlier, more naturalistic portrait, and the sculptor then refined it into a more idealized version by adding the plaster layer. In other words, this is simply a record of the artistic process, the same way a painter might revise a canvas. Sketch first, polish second. But another interpretation is harder to shake. In ancient Egyptian royal art, idealization was not just an aesthetic preference, it was a theological statement. The pharaoh and those associated with divine power were not merely depicted as beautiful, they were depicted as perfected, as existing in a state beyond ordinary human imperfection. To show a queen with a bump on her nose and shadows under her eyes was to show a mortal. To smooth those features away was, in a very real sense, to elevate her into something closer to divine. If that reading is correct, then what Thutmose did was remarkable. He first captured Nefertiti as she actually looked, real, specific, human, and then deliberately concealed that truth beneath an idealized image that served the needs of royal power and religious propaganda. He kept the truth for himself, buried in limestone, where no one was ever supposed to find it, and no one did find it. For about 3,500 years, there is something quietly extraordinary about that. A sculptor in ancient Egypt made a private, honest portrait of the most powerful woman in the world, hid it inside the official, idealized version, and the secret survived intact until the age of medical imaging. I cannot prove that was his intention, but you cannot help wondering. Which brings us to the eye, because if the hidden inner face is the first great mystery of this object, the missing left eye is the second, and in some ways, the more baffling of the two. The right eye of the bust is exquisite. It has a detailed inlay, a dark iris, a white sclera, a fine rim of black paint that gives it an uncanny, almost startling lifelike quality. The left eye socket is completely empty, no inlay, just bare plaster. This has been puzzling people since the day the bust was found. Explanations have been proposed and debated for over 100 years. One early suggestion was simply that the left eye inlay was lost after the bust was buried, that it fell out or was removed and never recovered. But the right eye is still perfectly in place, which makes accidental loss a little hard to swallow. Another suggestion is that the bust, being a sculptor's studio model rather than a finished ceremonial object, was never completed. The eye may simply have been left as a reminder of where the inlay needed to go, a placeholder that was never filled because the bust was never meant to be displayed publicly. A third interpretation, which some scholars find compelling, is that the empty socket was intentional. That in Egyptian symbolic language, a figure depicted without an eye was in some sense incomplete, deliberately depowered, unable to look back at the viewer, unable to exert the divine force that a fully formed royal image was thought to possess. On a workshop model, you might want to limit the spiritual potency of the object. You would not want a fully realized divine image sitting around the studio where ordinary craftsmen were working. None of these explanations has ever fully satisfied everyone, and to this day, the question remains open. One eye sees, one eye is blind, and the bust stares out at you with that slightly lopsided, unfathomable expression, and you realize that the mystery was built into the object on purpose, or by accident. And either way, you are not going to solve it in an afternoon. If you find yourself going deeper and deeper into questions like this one, questions that sit right at the edge of what archaeology can answer, then this channel is the place you want to be. We dig into exactly this kind of story every week, and the community of people watching along is genuinely one of the more curious and sharp-minded groups I have ever encountered. If you have not yet, consider subscribing and joining us. There is always another layer to uncover. But now, back to Nefertiti herself, because her personal story may be the biggest mystery of all. We know that Nefertiti and Akhenaten had 6 daughters together. We know she was prominent, even dominant, in the religious and artistic life of the Amarna period. And then, somewhere around the middle of Akhenaten's reign, she largely vanishes from the official record. Some inscriptions that once bore her name were altered. Images that appear to show her were changed or defaced. For a long time, the most common assumption was that she fell out of favor, that she was demoted, exiled, or died. But over the past several decades, a different and far more dramatic theory has gathered serious scholarly support. Some researchers now believe that Nefertiti did not disappear from the historical record because her power ended. They believe she disappeared because her role changed so dramatically that she took on an entirely new identity. After Akhenaten's death, there was a brief period of uncertain succession. The historical record shows a ruler with a name that translates roughly as Neferuaten, a name that Nefertiti had used as part of her own extended royal titles during Akhenaten's reign. Some scholars now believe that Neferuaten and Nefertiti were the same person, that after her husband's death, she stepped forward not as a regent or a background figure, but as pharaoh of Egypt in her own right. If that is true, and it is still debated, still uncertain, still the kind of claim that gets archaeology conferences heated, then the woman whose face is preserved in that Berlin museum was not simply the beautiful queen on the royal portrait. She was a ruler of one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, governing a vast country during one of its most turbulent transitions, in an age when women ruling alone was almost without precedent. That is a very different story from the one the smooth, idealized surface of the bust seems to tell. And it fits, somehow, with the hidden face underneath, more complex, more human, more real than the polished official image. The question of where the bust belongs has never gone away, either. Egypt has, on multiple occasions over the decades, formally requested the return of the bust to Cairo. The argument from the Egyptian side is both legal, the circumstances of the original transfer are disputed, and cultural, that a national treasure of this magnitude belongs in the country of its origin, accessible to Egyptians and to the millions of visitors who travel to Egypt specifically to experience its ancient heritage. The argument from Berlin is that the museum provides world-class conservation and global access, and that the object has been in Germany for over a century. This debate, too, remains unresolved, and it adds yet another layer to an already layered object, because the bust is not merely an archaeological artifact. It is a political object, a symbol of contested history, a reminder that the story of how the modern world acquired the treasures of antiquity is not always comfortable. So what do we actually understand, in the end, about this one remarkable object? We understand that it was made by a named, gifted sculptor in a revolutionary royal workshop. We understand that it contains, hidden within itself, a portrait of a real face that was then deliberately idealized. We understand that its missing eye has never been fully explained. And we understand that the woman it depicts may have been far more powerful and far more complicated than the elegant, serene surface of the bust suggests. What we do not understand, and what I think is worth sitting with, is the full weight of what Thutmose was doing when he carved that inner face and then covered it over. He was making a choice between truth and presentation, between the woman as she was and the woman as power required her to be shown. And he made both versions. He kept both, as if some part of him understood that the real face mattered, even if no one would ever see it. That impulse, to preserve the true thing underneath the official one, feels surprisingly modern, surprisingly human, and it lasted 3,000 years in the dark before the right technology came along to find it. The bust of Nefertiti is not a solved mystery. It is a mystery that keeps revealing new rooms the closer you look. A hidden face, a blind eye, a vanishing queen who may have seized a throne, a century-old dispute about who she belongs to now. Every answer opens another question, and that is exactly the kind of history I find most worth spending time with. I want to know what you think. The inner limestone face, is it a record of the artistic process, a private, honest portrait, or something else entirely? And what about the empty eye socket? Do you think it was never finished, intentionally left incomplete, or something we have not thought of yet? Drop your theory in the comments. Seriously, the people watching this channel consistently have the sharpest takes, and I read every one. If this kind of deep dive into ancient mysteries is your kind of thing, there is a video I think you will want to watch next. One that looks at the other figures of the Amarna period and the strange ways that entire chapter of Egyptian history was almost deliberately erased from the record after it ended. That story connects directly to what we talked about today, and it is just as strange. Thank you for spending this time with me. This is exactly the kind of history that keeps pulling me back. The kind where a lump of painted limestone turns out to be carrying secrets that take 3 millennia and a hospital scanner to uncover. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is always more to find, and I will see you in the next one.